Starting off this countdown, we have the Hitchhiker's Killer. The Hitchhiker's Killer is the name given to serial killer Donald Henry Gaskins. He started his killings in 1969, where he would pick up hitchhikers to later kill them. It's believed that he killed more than a dozen people. But even before he went on this killing spree, Gaskins had a history of sick crimes. Finally, on November 14th of 1975, Gaskins was arrested after a man witnessed him killing 2 men and called the police. He was later sentenced to death, but this sentence turned into life imprisonment without any possibility of parole. However, his killings did not stop while behind bars. While in prison, he became the only man to have ever killed an inmate on death row.
In our number 9 spot today, we have John Battaglia. John Battaglia is certainly quite a piece of work. On May 2nd, 2001, the mother of his 2 daughters dropped the girls off for their weekly visit with their father. Unfortunately, instead of having dinner like they were supposed to, John ended up killing the girls instead. I'm not going to go into any of the details of that because it is obviously an incredibly horrible situation, but he did do this while on the phone with the girl's mother, and he says that his dislike for her is the reason behind these killings. Whether that is true or not, I just want to make it absolutely clear that there is never a good enough reason to do something like this. After deliberating for just 19 minutes, the jury in his trial found him guilty of the highest charge, which is capital murder. On February 1st, 2018 at 9:40 p.m., John was executed by the state. John has always held up this act of the doting and devoted father, and hearing him talk about the girls is incredibly chilling. He talks about them with a sense of pride and love, like he didn't do one of the most evil things in the entire world.
In marriage, she had stomach about 8 or 9 months, pregnant when she took that picture.
And when you think about that, like, what do you think about?
I mean, you think about your best little friend. Nicest little kid you ever know.
Also, how he continues to blame his ex-wife for the death of his children is pretty telling of just how messed up his mind really was.
She ruined my daughter's life, and she ruined my daughter.
I mean, do you feel like you were killing them to get back at your
I don't feel like I killed.
You what?
I don't feel like I killed.
In our 8th spot, we have Ted Bundy. Now, what was so scary about Ted Bundy is how smart he was. He was the definition of evil genius. So basically, he would use his smarts to manipulate women and then kill them. Bundy is said to be responsible for murdering 30 women, although it's thought that his number is much higher. Now, Bundy was actually able to escape custody multiple times. The first time, he jumped out of a 2nd-story building and fled while at the courthouse. He had planned this for days, practicing jumping from his top bed bunk in prison down to the floor to strengthen his ankles. Now, eventually he was caught, but then a while later he escaped again. This time, he forced himself to lose weight in order to squeeze through a hole in his cell ceiling. When he did escape the 2nd time, he went on to murder more women, until being caught once again. In our 7th spot, we have Charles Manson. Infamous cult leader Charles Manson, who led the Manson family cult, had his followers commit crimes and murders on his behalf. Some of his members committed a series of 9 murders in July and August of 1969. In 1971, Manson was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder for the deaths of 7 people, including film actress Sharon Tate. What's scary about Manson is that he was also an evil genius. If you've ever seen his interviews, he acts quite wild and strange. People think that he's out of his mind. At one point, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia and paranoid delusion disorder, but some people think that he was just too smart for his own good and he was just faking all of this. In 1971, Manson received the death sentence, but a year later, the government got rid of capital punishment, so his sentence was changed to life in prison instead. In our 6th spot, we have Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. Between 1963 and 1965, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley worked together to torture, take advantage of, and kill a number of young individuals. What they did was incredibly messed up, and it'll make your stomach churn. Now, these two were actually given the name the Moors Murderers, because after taking the lives of their victims, they would bury their bodies on the moors outside of Manchester. Both individuals were sentenced to life in prison for their crimes. Ian was actually placed in solitary confinement, whereas Myra died in prison in 2002. We are now at our 5th and than halfway mark with Lester Eubanks. In 1965, Lester was convicted of taking the life of Mary Ellen Diener. As a result, he was given the death penalty, which later got changed to a life sentence. Now, over the years in prison, apparently Lester changed his ways and became very well behaved. In fact, on December 7th, 1973, they let him go out to Christmas shop for his family. While out in a mall, he managed to escape his guards and flee. To this day, he still hasn't been caught. He's out there somewhere in hiding. Who knows where he fled to or what he's up to now. Coming in at number 4, we have Robert William Fisher. Now, this guy is one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives. He is on the run after a triple homicide and arson. On April 9th, 2001, Fisher took the lives of his wife and 2 children before blowing up their house. It is still unclear as to why he did this, and he's been on the run ever since. And police have no leads. On April 20th, his car was found in a forest near Payson, Arizona, but Robert was nowhere to be found. On November 3rd, 2021, Fisher was removed from the FBI's most wanted fugitives list. But despite them doing this, he still remains a very wanted fugitive. In our third spot, we have Bradford Bishop. Bradford Bishop Jr. is a former United States Foreign Service officer who is now a wanted fugitive. On March 1st of 1976, Bishop started to spiral after not receiving the promotion he really wanted. He then left his work early, drove to the bank, withdrew money, and then bought a sledgehammer, gas can, shovel, and pitchfork. He then returned home where he killed his wife, mother, and 3 sons. He then drove the bodies several miles away before burying them in a wooded swamp area before setting them on fire. As a result, he was placed on the FBI's list of 10 most wanted fugitives. They have no clue as to where Bishop is now. He could be anywhere, but they do believe that he fled to Europe. Moving on to number 2, we have Arthur Hutchinson. Arthur Hutchinson has lived a life of crime for murder, attempted murder, theft, and burglary. In fact, he spent 5 years in prison for the attempted murder of his half-brother. In September of 1983, he was brought into a police station after being arrested for theft. While there, he asked to go to the bathroom and then proceeded to jump out of the bathroom window and fled. He was on the run for 3.5 weeks. While on the run, he crashed a wedding and murdered the bride's father, mother, and brother. Later that day, he broke into another person's home and stabbed all 3 of the residents to death. He was finally caught November 5th of 1983 and sentenced to life imprisonment. And in our number 1 spot today, we have Ahmed Siraji. From 1986 to 1997, Ahmed took the lives of 42 females. The bodies of his victims were found in a sugarcane field. What he would do was, after killing them, he would bury them waist deep in his field with their heads facing his house. He believed that by doing so, this gave him great power. But he was later caught and arrested alongside his sisters and 3 wives who helped him. One of his wives was actually sentenced to death, but that was later changed to life imprisonment. Ahmed, on the other hand, was sentenced to death by a firing squad in 2008.
Psychopathic Ted Bundy terrifies us first on this list at number 10. A very well-educated, charming, and handsome man. This is how some people used to describe Ted Bundy. Well, that is until they discovered that he was actually a brutal serial killer on a murderous rampage. He could have had a bright future in politics, but there's only one problem. He was responsible for the deaths and abductions of approximately 35 women over the course of about 5 years. He stalked and killed women that looked like his ex-girlfriend. He kidnapped, bludgeoned, and strangled them to death. He even performed acts of necrophilia on the bodies. He used his wit and charm to break himself out of prison, and not just once, but twice.
I don't believe any of us thought that Ted Bundy would be able to stop killing. It was of serious concern to us that his desire and need to kill was growing while he was in jail, and that compulsion was going to be acted out soon.
But ultimately, he was executed by the electric chair in 1989.
In our 9th spot today, we have Glenn Stark Chambers. In January of 1975, Glenn Stark Chambers got into a heated dispute with his girlfriend, Connie Weeks. It ended with him taking her life. As a result, he was sentenced to death by electric chair, later reduced to life imprisonment. However, Glenn escaped prison on July 13th. Glenn, with 2 other inmates, ganged up to attack their detention officer and then escaped through a window. Now, he was captured 3 days later, but only to escape several years later. So he worked with the prison to help build furniture. He came up with a good idea to put himself into one of the boxes and have himself carried out of prison in a transport truck, and it worked. Even after 3 decades, Glenn has never been found. If he was still alive today, he would be in his 70s, so he could still be out there somewhere.
Number 8 brings us to Pedro Alonso Lopez. He is a very notorious serial killer from Colombia who was responsible for murdering more than 300 girls across South America. He would lure them into, secluded areas or inside abandoned buildings where he would viciously assault them before brutally killing them. I don't want to go into all of the gory details, but I think we can all agree that he was definitely not a saint. He later confessed to over 300 murders, but the police only believed him when a flash flood uncovered a mass grave that contained a lot of his victims. Eventually 53 bodies were discovered, and he was ultimately sentenced to life in prison. Dr. Harold Chipman slices his way in at number 7. He was a trusted doctor who was well respected in his community. However, his colleagues didn't know the dark truth about Dr. Shipman. He was responsible for up to 250 murders. Is this real life right now? He would inject fatal doses of a drug into his patients, which would quickly lead to their deaths. He forged their wills so that he can inherit large sums of money, and he put in cremation requests so the body would be destroyed and no one would be able to trace it back to him. A judge sentenced him to 15 consecutive life sentences. I mean, fair enough, and recommended that he was never released. Well, Dr. Shipman hanged himself in his cell back in January of 2004. The chessboard killer is in at number 6. Alexander Piskoshkin was given the nickname a chessboard killer because he was obsessed with the game of chess. But as it turns out, he had an even darker obsession that involved killing people. By the time that he was arrested in 2006, he had already killed at least 48 people in Russia, but he planned on killing way more than that. His goal was to get to 64 kills, one for each space on the chessboard, and his killing progressed. His attacks got even more savage. But he would leave broken vodka bottles sticking out of some of his victims' skulls, and he didn't seem too worried about hiding the bodies. He began killing at 18 years old when he invited one of his friends to go on a killing expedition. They began walking around trying to find someone to kill, but when it became clear that his friend was no longer interested in killing someone, Piskoshkin decided to kill him instead. Now at number 5 we have Jack the Ripper. This guy right here. And yeah, he's in black and white. It wasn't a situation where we're like, oh, we're just so lazy right now, we can't find an image, let's just slap this one on there. But yeah, it's black and white because he might be actually the first ever famously known serial killer, but we actually don't know who this guy was. So he was given the nickname Jack the Ripper. This is what he might have looked like. Jack the Ripper terrorized London, England. He would murder his victims, which seemed to be females, and he would remove their internal organs. This unknown man didn't just remove these organs, he did it in a way a surgeon would do it. It is believed that this man had anatomical or surgical knowledge. So was it a doctor roaming around the streets killing people by night and trying to fix them up in the daytime? Who knows? Instead of Jack the Ripper, shouldn't he have been called like Doctor of the Night or Doctor Strange? Oh wait, is that a movie? Doctor Strange. Moving into number 4, we have Jeffrey Dahmer. He might be one of the most intelligent people on this list. He had crime spanning for 3 decades, and killing people doesn't even bother him.
I desensitized myself to it. I don't know, I went to great lengths.
He is pure evil, but you'd never know it by looking at him. But when you hear him, that's another story.
Jeffrey murdered people in his 20s. He murdered from 1978 all the way to 1991 without being caught, and he was sentenced to 16 terms of life in prison. He actually passed away at the age of 34 years old by another inmate who thought this guy was sick. This right here is Christopher Scarver, the man who became famous for murdering Jeffrey Dahmer, and now he is in the history books for killing one of the most famous murderers of all time. Scarver is currently serving 3 counts of murder, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. And at number 3, we have the Zodiac Killer, who always finds a way onto our lists, but we have no idea of his identity. Who the heck is the Zodiac Killer? Is it you? Well, we might never know the answer. We have a picture of what he might look like. Here it is right here. It looks like it could be many different people. This person had crime spanning in the 60s and 70s, and it is said that this person killed up to 37 victims, but that number could be much higher. Since we don't know who he is, we can't get a lot of information about his murders. And it's been decades since the murders, and even with all the technology we have today, we still can't figure out who this person was. The Zodiac Killer even left taunting cryptic messages, but we still can't figure out what he was saying. Next up, number 2, we can't have a list without a famous American cult leader who may never have killed someone himself, with his own hands, but he is responsible for the deaths of multiple people. Yeah, you guys probably guessed who I'm talking about. We're talking about Charles Manson. Charles Manson was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Originally, he was given the death penalty, but that was later commuted to life with the possibility of parole after the death penalty was abolished in California. He has passed away in prison at the age of 83 years old. Charles Manson is known to be a very terrifying psychopath and has very similar tendencies as the Joker.
Tell me in a sentence who you are.
Nobody. I'm nobody.
I think that is just the creepiest thing that I've seen all day. Well, one person who is scarier than Charles Manson and the Joker himself, I would say, is our next guy at number 1. This right here is John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy was an intelligent American serial killer who murdered at least 33 teenage boys and young men in a span of just 6 years. This took place in Chicago back in the 70s. He actually buried 26 of his victims' bodies in the crawl space of his own home. Imagine buying that house and finding all of these bodies in your crawl space. Gacy was quickly sentenced to death and spent 14 years on death row, and then he was executed by lethal injection at the Stateville Correctional Center back in 1994 at the age of 54 years old. Gacy was only 30 years old when he started murdering people, and who knows, maybe he could have been much younger than that. Gacy was all over the news when he was finally caught.
When this whole thing is over, you might be witnessing one of the most horrible crimes, perhaps, in a century.
Oh, and get this. He also went by the nickname of the Killer Clown, or Pogo the Clown.
Starting off this countdown, we have the psychopath's behavior.
When I was the punisher, I was the one who decided punishment over the I was the one who spanked the
This interview features a man named Robert, who has been deemed a psychopath. In the interview, he talks about the crimes he has committed and his thought processes as he commits these crimes, or lack thereof. What's horrifying is how candidly he talks about this all, and how he's proud of his crimes. He also shows no shame or guilt.
I would tell myself, well, she's not going to be like that. She is going to be the perfect mate. And I told myself that.
Just then, he was talking about a young girl he took advantage of, and basically coerced her into having a relationship with him. You can tell he got a sense of pleasure while talking about what he did to that individual. It's very sickening.
I was grooming her to fit me. To fit me.
It's so creepy how he is so calm while talking about all of this. Again, he's gaining this sense of pleasure just thinking back to his crimes.
Dennis Rader breaks onto this list at number 9. He is a serial killer from America who murdered at least 10 people in Kansas. He is known as the BTK Killer. We've talked about this guy many times on this channel, and he was given the name because of the way that he would murder his victims. BTK stands for bind, torture, and kill. After he killed his victims, he sent disturbing letters to the police and the media boasting about his crime. He created a hit kit, which was a briefcase full of items that he would use on his victims, such as guns, tape, rope, and handcuffs. Rader would strangle his victims until they lost consciousness, and then he would revive them only to strangle them again. He would repeat this pattern over and over again, and then do some other pretty disturbing things. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison, where he is currently still serving time today.
Coming in at number 8, we have Susan Atkins.
But that we were instructed to go all the way down every house, hit every house on the
On the street?
On the street, yes.
And kill all the people in
Kill all
those
the
houses?
people in all those houses.
Susan Atkins was an American murderer and loyal member of the Manson cult. She participated in 8 killings, all under the order of Charles Manson. In the cult, she went by the name Sadie Mae Flutes or Sexy Sadie. She also played a role in the killing of famous actress Sharon Tate. In this interview, Susan talks about the Tate murder.
And we drove to the house with instructions to kill everyone in the house.
From Charlie?
Yeah.
Now, what made people mad about this interview is they claimed that Susan was trying to act like a victim. She was trying to gain sympathy to lessen her sentence.
The people in the house were all brought into the living room and tied up, and I remember that Wojtek Wachowski, I believe is his name, I had tied his hands with a towel and then was instructed to kill him.
Whether she has actual remorse or not, hearing her recount the night of this dark deed is very creepy. In our 7th spot, we have Bernard Giles.
Wife and daughter, and you just, something hit you and you went,
no.
Today may be the day?
Every day may be the day.
Every day?
Every day may be the day.
In this interview, serial killer Bernard Giles recounts his first murder to Piers Morgan. It is so chilling to hear him talk in depth about what he did to Nancy Jerry. He told Morgan that he picked her up and drove her to a wooded area where he did the deed. What's scary is that out of all the people Morgan has interviewed, Bernard is the first one who didn't try to prove his innocence. He openly admits that he's guilty and has killed people. At the beginning of the interview, Morgan says, and I quote, "You are serving 5 life sentences for killing 5 young women. My first question is, did you kill those women?" And he calmly replies with, "Yes, sir, I did." This dude has no remorse and no emotions. He even admits to it. What a creepy, creepy dude.
In our number 6 spot today, we have Tommy Lynn Sells. Tommy Lynn Sells was an American serial killer who was responsible for 22 confirmed deaths, but authorities have said that they know there are more. One of the aspects that scares me the most while watching him talk about his crimes is how you can tell that he committed these acts because he wanted to and because he liked it.
It was the best feeling I ever had in my life. And the first time I killed somebody, it was such a rush. And it was just like that shot of dope. Every time I did it, it was that rush again.
There is no doubt that Tommy is an actual psychopath, but on December 31st in 1999, Tommy messed with the wrong girl. After severely injuring Crystal Searles, who he thought was dead, this incredible young girl was able to walk a quarter of a mile with a severed trachea to her neighbor's house, where they of course got her help. Crystal ended up surviving and gave such a good description of Tommy, and in the end was able to identify him to the authorities. Crystal not only survived her own absolute nightmare, but she most definitely saved who knows how many lives with her bravery. In watching Tommy talk about his crimes, there is clearly just a lack of emotion or an emptiness behind his eyes.
If I called you something that you didn't like, you'd think about killing me?
Well, if we was in a fight and, get your head down in the concrete, then, so be it, but
what happens when my head goes down to the concrete?
Well, what do you think happened? It cracks like a coconut.
Tommy ended up being executed on April 3rd, 2014. In our number 5 spot today, we have Alex Enriquez. Alex Enriquez is more commonly known as the Bronx serial killer. Alex is convicted of killing 3 females from 1989 to 1990 and is currently serving 3 consecutive 25 years to life sentences. Alex has been incarcerated since the early 90s, but still to this day maintains that he was innocent. There wasn't an overwhelming amount of physical evidence in this case, but there was a detail that Alex gave to authorities in an interrogation that was true to the crime, but it was a fact that police didn't even know at the time, so how could Alex have possibly known this? A few years ago, Alex sat down with Piers Morgan for an interview where he of course claimed his innocence, while also telling some pretty confusing stories.
The bodies.
You gave them a particular piece of information.
Because they told me.
But they did not know. How could they tell you something they didn't know?
That's what they tell you.
They hadn't cleaned the garment, so they're lying too.
Do you really think they said the truth?
There was also a witness testimony from a man who saw and spoke to Alex at one of his crime scenes on the night that it was committed, and of course Alex had some excuse for why this was untrue.
Says he saw you there.
Do you believe that? Have you seen?
You tell me, were you there?
No, I wasn't there.
I'm not sure about you guys, but this part definitely gives me major OJ if I did it vibes. At the end of the day, maybe he did not commit these crimes, and it would of course be extremely tragic that he has been wrongly convicted, but if he did in fact commit these crimes, it's pretty unsettling that after all these years, he still just can't even admit it.
In our fourth spot, we have Ed Kemper. I featured Ed in part 2 of this series, but I think this other interview he did was worse than the first one. So Ed Kemper, or Big Ed, is an American serial killer who took the lives of 10 individuals. This reign started back in 1964, when he took the lives of his grandparents. And he said he did it just to see what killing felt like. This hour-and-a-half interview was filmed in 1991 when Ed was 42 years old. I think what makes this so disturbing is how smart he is.
Extended period of time, and then in the early 80s they came up with this differentiation called serial killing, which was living two lives basically. If one orients to the negative side of that living, he would say this person was living a cover life.
He's very well spoken, and in the interview he went on to describe his tendencies and why he thinks he became a killer, and how he thinks young people need to be supported so they don't end up like him.
Getting youngsters like that help to where they can find themselves and they can find value in themselves and they can find value in interacting with others, and they go in a different direction than what I did.
It's crazy and creepy. Like, this dude is too smart for his own good. In our third spot, we have Jodi Arias. On June 4th, 2008, Jodi Arias took the life of her boyfriend, Travis Alexander. He was in the shower at the time of his death. It's really brutal what she did to him. After she did the deed, she took photos of him on her camera and then threw it in the washing machine as an attempt to get rid of evidence. But upon investigating, her DNA, among other things, were found at the crime scene and she was arrested. So this interview was conducted after her trial. People were outraged by the number of lies she tells in this interview.
Was it unexpected, you think, this verdict?
It was unexpected. For me, yes, because there was no premeditation on my part. I can see how things look that way, but I didn't expect the premeditation. I could see maybe the felony murder because of how the law is written.
She claims the murder wasn't premeditated, but her actions say otherwise. She had it all planned out. She took his life and then dyed her hair, rented a car, cleaned up the crime scene, and fled. In the interview, she also tries to gain sympathy from the watchers. You can tell she's putting on a face of sorrow. You even see her clock the camera, and then when she realizes she's being recorded, that's when that whole act began. It's really scary and dark.
In our number 2 spot today, we have Ted Bundy. If you know anything about true crime, you most definitely have heard of one of the most famous killers of all time, Ted Bundy. Ted killed upwards of 30 people during his crime spree in the 1970s. Most interviews with Ted are extremely well known, but there is one interview that is very disturbing that is not quite as popular as the others. In this interview, he is talking about taking the life of 18-year-old student Georgianne Hawkins. The chilling part of it is how he talks about things just so matter-of-factly, like it's a casual conversation between friends and not him describing the horrific acts that he committed.
She was quite lucid, talking about things. It's funny, it's not funny, but it's odd the kinds of things people say under those circumstances. She had a Spanish test the next day, and she thought that I had taken her to help tutor me for a Spanish test.
After that clip, this interview unfortunately gets even more disturbing as he begins whispering some more terrifying details. When I first saw this interview, I was listening through headphones, and you guys, the chill you get from having an absolute monster whispering in your ear is truly incomparable.
The Hawkins girl's head was severed and taken up the road about 25 to 50 yards and buried in a location about 10 yards west of the road on a rocky hillside.
horrible whispering part, he continues on with the rest of the details of that day in the same casual conversation tone that we heard before. If it wasn't obvious before, after listening to this specific interview, it is very clear just how disturbing Ted Bundy really was. In our number 1 spot today, we have Michael Turner. In 2008, Michael Turner fatally shot his wife as she was about to end their relationship and also was planning to turn him into the authorities. In the process of this terrible crime, he also injured 2 of their As far as I know, the injuries to the were accidental, but this obviously does not take away from the terrible thing that he did, as well as the fact of that is literally one of the many reasons why you shouldn't kill someone. In a jailhouse interview, Michael gives a chilling account of what happened on that day, as well as discussing intention and motive. There is a part where he is discussing how he loves his kids and how they love him.
You say you love your kids?
Man, as you see, I've been up for them since I've been home from prison. Hell yeah, I love my kids. And my kids love me, you hear me? I don't know if they still do. But I know my son told me shit before he left. Before I left the house, he told me shit, Daddy, he still love me. You know what I'm saying?
But then later, when asked about how he could love his kids and then harm their mom, he gives quite an answer.
You say you love your kids, but you killed their mama.
So what?
And you're going to jail.
So what?
So you left them alone.
Do what?
You left them alone.
Left them alone?
Yeah.
They got grandparents, they got other people who love them. You know, all that don't matter. They mama up. You know what I'm saying?
It honestly is this callous disregard for the life that he took, as well as the effect this whole situation will have on his kid's life, that is just absolutely unfathomable to me.